In September 1781, the French fleet won one of the most important victories in history at the Battle of Chesapeake. Just over a month later, with no means of reinforcement or evacuation, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army to George Washington at Yorktown. The significance of the British defeat was not lost on anyone. News reached Versailles first, to the delight of the King and Queen. In London, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." North's cry was perhaps premature. Yorktown meant that American independence no longer seemed in doubt, but that was about all. In the wider war, being fought in Canada, the Caribbean, India and Gibraltar, the outcome was far from settled. Over the next 2 years, the Allies were in a race against time to extract as much as possible from a beleaguered, but not beaten Britain, before London revived its strength, split the alliance, and the ever-looming threat of bankruptcy caught up with them. North's government staggered on for a few months longer with the support of the king, who was not yet reconciled to the loss of America, believing if the 13 colonies went, the rest of Britain's empire would soon follow. But by March 1782, the game was clearly up for the unfortunate Prime Minister, and he was replaced with a ministry formed by Lord Rockingham. The old departments of Northern and Southern Secretary were combined into one Foreign Office under Charles James Fox, whilst the Earl of Shelburne took over the colonial portfolio, technically still responsible for the rebellious colonies. The new government almost immediately began peace negotiations, but this was about all the fractious cabinet agreed on. Fox and Shelburne began bickering straight away, with the Foreign Secretary wanting to grant immediate independence to the colonies so as to better focus on the Bourbon powers, while Shelburne still aimed to try and preserve some form of link with the Americans. Had the defeat at Yorktown put the whole war effort in existential peril, minds might have been more focused, but Britain was far from beaten across the rest of the world. More than 30,000 troops remained in North America, with New York and Charleston still under occupation. British naval strength was gradually reviving, and French attempts to oust the East India Company in the subcontinent had failed. True, Gibraltar seemed liable to fall at any moment, and the Bourbon powers were preparing to deliver the coup de grace to the British Empire by seizing Jamaica, but London's problem was arguably that the military situation gave her too much freedom of action for a fractious cabinet to deal with. The situation was perhaps best exemplified by the farcical scene of Shelburne and Fox each sending their own representative to begin negotiations in Paris. Across the Channel, the Allied powers were also ready for talks. At the beginning of 1782, both America and France were in strong positions militarily, but financially, the countries were facing serious problems. In the 13 colonies, the worth of a paper dollar had dropped 700 times less than its face value, and everyone was aware that the mutinies that had occurred the previous winter could happen again at any time. France, expecting a short conflict in 1778, had instead fought for 4 years at enormous expense, and was approaching a serious risk of bankruptcy. Just Spain remained generally in favour of continuing the war, as despite having reclaimed Minorca, Gibraltar remained an essential aim. For several months, the only American representative was Benjamin Franklin, with Adams still negotiating a commercial treaty in the Netherlands, and John Jay becoming bedridden with influenza almost as soon as he arrived from Spain. Franklin was generally in favour of reconciliation with Britain, but immovable on the issue of full American independence. The question for the British was thus on what terms the colonies would be granted independence. Fox favoured an immediate recognition, which he hoped would see the US drop out of the war, while Shelburne only wanted to extend recognition as part of a general settlement with the Bourbon powers. Franklin and the French Foreign Minister Vergennes had agreed to negotiate separately, but to conclude no separate peace. Franklin was thus left in a delicate position. A separate peace likely meant one more favourable to the US, as the British would make extra concessions to break up the coalition, but it also meant betraying the French, on whom the US was financially dependent. Franklin played the double game subtly, convincing Shelburne that if Britain offered generous terms to the US, he would help Britain counter the more extravagant Franco-Spanish demands by threatening to make a separate peace. Whilst the talks with Franklin were ongoing, the British were concurrently negotiating with the French as well, more specifically the Foreign Minister Vergennes. In many ways the architect of Britain's defeat, he had countered British statesmen brilliantly throughout the war, forestalling every attempt London made at breaking its international isolation and managing the large coalition that eventually toppled her American empire. Vergennes' aims were in many ways the most subtle of any powers. Whilst he wanted Britain reduced and France's prestige in Europe resurrected, he seems to have not intended to end her status as a great power, or allow the United States to be strengthened too much. Even so, negotiations were stalling in the early days of 1782, as the British refused to countenance demands for Gibraltar or other Caribbean territories. For now, time seemed to be on Vergennes' side, with de Grasse, the victor of Chesapeake, moving south to facilitate a Bourbon attack on Jamaica. Then, in June, news arrived of Admiral Rodney's great victory at the Saints. 7 ships of the line had been lost, with de Grasse himself captured. Although Rodney failed to take the chance to annihilate the French fleet, the victory tilted the naval balance in Britain's favour decisively. Worse was still to come, as reports from the east warned of an impending crisis in the Crimea between Russia and France's Ottoman ally. Added to this was the eternal bane of Versailles in the shape of finance. With Vergennes having agreed to another 6 million livres loan for the Americans, France was rapidly approaching the limits of her ability to borrow. These factors suggested that Vergennes should have taken whatever terms he could get and liquidated the war as soon as possible, which he generally seems to have hoped to do. But he was hamstrung by his Spanish ally, which in 1779, as the price for alliance, had extracted a commitment that there would be no peace without the return of Gibraltar. Thus, Vergennes had to await the fate of the Grand Assault being prepared for later that year. Negotiations then, by mid-1782, seemed at an impasse. However, on the 1st of July, Rockingham died and George III appointed Shelburne Prime Minister, whom Fox refused to serve under, finally allowing for some clarity in British policy. Franklin had maintained a long friendship with Shelburne since well before the war, and with him now directing British policy fully, the American felt secure in moving to finalise negotiations. The Saints had convinced many that French help would be far more sparse in the future. Franklin thus got to the point and handed Shelburne's representative a list of articles for any peace treaty that he divided between necessary and advisable clauses. Shelburne agreed to all of the necessary articles, but none of the advisable, which Franklin was being exceptionally cheeky with anyway, considering the increasing weakness of the American position. Even all of the necessary articles were not, ironically, necessary for Britain to concede given the international situation post-Saints, but Shelburne was desperate for peace and prepared to concede more than needed. In fact, the Americans could almost certainly have gained a more favourable settlement on the Canadian border had they pushed for it. In return, Shelburne expected that generosity to Franklin would force Vergennes to accede to far more modest terms for the Bourbon powers, lest the Americans take their concessions and run, leaving the French high and dry. His plan was partly scuppered by a few remaining stumbling blocks with the Americans, particularly compensation and treatment of loyalists. These could probably have been dealt with had Franklin not fallen ill with kidney stones, to be replaced by a recovered Jay, who feared a British trick and thus continued to string out negotiations. At best an amateur statesman, at worst an incompetent, Jay convinced himself Britain and France were conspiring to strike a bargain at America's expense. He was particularly sensitive on a French attempt to mediate on rival Spanish claims to land beyond the Mississippi, for almost all Americans agreed the country must extend to the East Bank. By mid-August, Jay's suspicions that France was preparing to sell out America got the better of him. Essentially disobeying Congress's orders, he informed Shelburne that the US was prepared to abandon the French alliance and privately encouraged the British to recapture West Florida from Spain. With the hostile coalition successfully broken up, though more thanks to American rather than British efforts, Shelburne moved to conclude peace, which was finally done on the 30th of November, 1782. The US received a recognition of its independence, fair settlement and territorial boundaries, and fishing rights in Newfoundland. Britain, by contrast, gained an agreement on debt repayment and nothing else. The vague promises to loyalists were immediately reneged upon by the Americans, and native allies were hung out to dry, something declared as shameful and unpardonable in the House of Lords. The apparent leniency of these terms, not to mention betrayal of Britain's allies among loyalists and native tribes, saw Shelburne ejected from office and left his successors squabbling over the precise nature of America's northeastern frontier and fishing rights. Although the agreement of November the 30th was technically conditional on terms also being reached between the British and French, it was regarded by everyone as a de facto end to the war in North America. Vergennes was both amazed at the extent of British concessions to the US and appalled at the apparent American betrayal of their agreement not to sign a separate peace. Now desperate to conclude terms himself, France also moved to rapidly end their war. Negotiations had again been ongoing with Britain since Shelburne's accession to the premiership in July. De Grasse was sent back to France with a memorandum reporting that Shelburne was in favour of wide-ranging concessions, but when Vergennes' representative was sent to confirm these, Shelburne denied having ever seen them. Nonetheless, he agreed to discuss the proposals anyway, declaring his hope that the peace would lay the foundation for a reconciliation and a new entente between Britain and France over Eastern Europe. Although not wholly convinced when he received this report, Vergennes was tempted by the prospect of aid in the deteriorating eastern situation. His determination was further reinforced when in September, the final enormous Franco-Spanish assault on Gibraltar failed completely. With the military situation turning against France, and money still draining out of the treasury, Vergennes chose to expedite the process by whittling down the number of concessions France demanded from the peace. But Aranda, the Spanish negotiator, was still not prepared to see Gibraltar go, stalling talks yet again as Britain refused to part with the rock that had now carved out a place in British hearts for its heroic resistance. When London reached an agreement with the Americans in November, Shelburne's stance hardened further. He suggested that Spain could take the whole of Florida in return for the recently captured Bahamas and Minorca. The Spanish finally reconciled themselves to the loss of Gibraltar, but were resolute in their refusal to hand back Minorca. Reluctantly, the British conceded, and the basis for an agreement with Spain was reached. For Vergennes' part, despite France having been the most important factor in the Allied victory, his spoils were notably small. Tobago was about the only significant colonial prize, though the more general aim of restoring France's prestige in Europe and reducing British power had undoubtedly been accomplished. The Dutch, who played with fire and gained third-degree burns, were basically told by Vergennes what they were losing and to like it. On the 20th of January, an armistice and preliminary peace agreement was agreed between Britain and the Allies. Negotiations over the final settlement would last until September 1783 and into 1784 where the Dutch were concerned, but for all intents and purposes, the American Revolutionary War was over. The final analysis is an interesting one. America and Spain came off the best from the war, the Dutch undoubtedly the worst. The United States was secured as an independent nation, and it was left to the American people, rather than British armies, to decide whether such a republican experiment could work. Spain had made good the losses of the 7 Years' War, but her decline had not been assuaged to any serious degree, and would continue apace with Charles III's death 5 years later. France, having fought to restore her position in Europe, found it brought lower than ever before in just a few short years, whilst a series of reactionary finance ministers, unable to cope with the debt accumulated in the war, left the country in economic ruin. Its ties with the United States rapidly faded as the new country re-established trade on favourable terms with London. The British case was perhaps the most interesting. Opinions in the immediate aftermath of the treaty were despairing. "We shall never again figure as a leading power in Europe," Lord Sandwich said, "but think ourselves happy if we can drag on for some years a contemptible existence as a commercial state." But as history was to show, this was much too pessimistic a reading of the treaty. Some at the time and since have argued that the military and financial situation favoured Britain, and a continuation of the war would have improved the peace terms. This is probably true, but it's doubtful the game was worth the candle. Reclaiming Minorca and perhaps seizing the Dutch Empire was hardly worth several more millions on an already bloated national debt. For the most part, the British Empire was preserved and left with the foundation for future greatness.